Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I'm Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very, very many reasons. This is just me talking. It's just an open conversation with me and whoever's here. Sometimes we have guests here, but haven't done that for a little while. Hopefully, we'll do that again soon. But you guys are here. Some of you hopefully will be in the chat talking. That's always more fun for me. And it's an open conversation, which means that we're talking to each other, we shape each other, and we shape each other's responses. Yes, that can be questions and answers and things like that, but it certainly doesn't have to be. Um, if you are in the chat and you say anything, just so that you know, if you're on Facebook watching this, it will be posted under your Facebook account. If you're on YouTube, it'll be under your Google account. If you're on Twitch, it'll be in your Twitch account. Keep that in mind. I try to do a good job of not mentioning people's names on the stream, but these videos are saved and your comments are saved underneath them, I believe. I think I'm getting faster and faster at being able to do that. I think that's everything. I run a practice, a therapy and executive functioning coaching practice called Effective Artistry. That's our logo up there in the corner. Our office is here in Northbrook, Illinois, but we do coaching with people all over the country, all over the world, actually. And I always pick a topic just to get started with, but we don't have to stay on that topic or even on related topics. We'll go where we go. You guys who are here in the chat, I appreciate you being here, and you're the primary. I don't know. There are other people watching this that aren't in the chat. There are other people that will be watching this later on when it's a VOD, but I don't know who those people are. I imagine you guys out there. I think about and I try to make this useful to as many people as I can, but the only specific information I have is about anybody who's actually chatting with me. I am tired today. I take ADHD medication, and my prescription ran out, and my doctor's office has not been renewing it. I've been requesting. They must be slammed. I'm sure there's a lot going on, so I have not taken it today, which is, I don't know, not a hugely terrible, awful thing. It's not something I need to get through the day, but I am a little more tired and have a harder time focusing, and things take a little bit more energy to do in terms of, no, I guess I should have thought through what I was going to say before I started that sentence. I was going to say in terms of productivity, but that's a tricky word to use without defining it. So let's define it. Just generally, actually, I've been having conversations around this lately, the idea of productivity or the idea of work or working hard. And these terms are useful, as all these terms that we use are, and vague, as all these terms that we specifically here spend time defining and exploring typically are. Otherwise, why would we spend that time on it? Basically, you can count anything as productive. You can count anything as work if you define it as productive or if you define it as work. So the category, the thing that determines whether or not you're going to use that phrase really tends to have more to do with how difficult or painful it is for you to go about doing it, in combination with how observably useful or valuable it is to other people. If you've been asked to do something by somebody else, a teacher or a boss especially, then it's a productive thing to do. If it builds something for the future, if it is in some way useful or beneficial to other people, then typically we're going to call it productive. If it's something that's just enjoyable for you personally, but nobody else enjoys it or benefits from it, we're typically not going to call it productive. That doesn't mean that it is or that it isn't. I'm just talking about how we tend to use these words. Like working hard. I've been working hard, or it takes a lot of hard work to do X, Y, or Z. What do we mean by that? Do we mean literally just the resources that go toward it? Because I could spend a lot of time and energy, playing video games or working on a hobby of mine or whatever. Are we going to call that working hard? Sometimes, but not usually. And even when we do, we're usually talking about it in the context of it's leading towards something we consider productive, valuable, useful to other people. In a sense, working hard more often than not is just a shorthand way of saying it's uncomfortable. I am pushing myself in a way that is difficult or painful or unsustainable. And that's, I don't know, it's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. We do that for reasons. There are reasons that we do all the things that we do. And some of the time, what we're doing is pushing hard, working hard in a way that's not sustainable. Because it's a temporary thing, or it's a necessary thing, or if it's not necessary, it's very valuable and beneficial, and it's worth in that moment to us doing it in that way. It becomes a problem when it starts to turn into something that you do indefinitely, that you have no criteria for determining whether it's worth continuing to do or to stop or to modify in some way. When working hard becomes in and of itself valuable, considered in and of itself valuable, which it is for many, many people, it is in our culture broadly, generally speaking, the idea that working hard is valuable in and of itself, regardless of what it leads to. In fact, oh man, this is probably a decade ago or so at this point, but for a while there, the term efforting became pretty popular, especially in like corporate jingoistic speak, not jingoistic speak, that's nationalistic stuff, but we're efforting toward blank blank. And it literally meant we're putting effort towards blank blank without knowing what outcome it's bringing back to us. You could say that me doing this stream is efforting towards outreach or something like that. That it's just saying we are putting resources into something and we don't know what will come back out of it. I'm taking so many sips of my tea because it is just the perfect temperature. I feel like I rarely get to drink my tea when it's the perfect temperature. It's either like it just came off and it's too hot, or I forget about it and it's cold. Efforting, what were we talking about? Hard work. Oh, yeah. When the idea of putting effort towards something is just valuable for no reason other than because you are putting effort toward it, it becomes problematic, especially in a culture in which, if you look at anybody who's successful in any field, regardless of what they themselves say about their success, although usually what I'm about to say is true of what they say about themselves, but if it's not, other people say it about them. What is it that makes somebody successful, right? What is the secret to their success? In our culture, almost always, we'll talk about two things in particular. They're really smart and they work really hard, both of which are impossible to define things. That's part of the reason that we use them to talk about why people are so successful. Of course, one of my favorite things about like the internet and a particular, I don't know if you'd call it a meme necessarily, but I would consider it a meme of people pointing out that people who have success tend to have had a lot of support in their past, especially have parents with a lot of money or who connected them with people with a lot of money. Because the truth at the end of the day is that the more that you accomplish, the more resources went towards accomplishing that thing. The greater, the bigger, the more impactful something is, as a rule, the more resources went toward that thing. And so if we're saying something about an individual doing something like that, what we really mean is that an individual was somehow the focal point or routed a lot of resources that were collected from a lot of different people towards something. That there's no such thing as a billionaire who doesn't have thousands and thousands of people working beneath them in a hierarchical structure, contributing surplus value, and we're getting into like, et cetera, I don't know, political things. Point was, because we then ascribe the success of those successful people to the fact that they are smart, which, hey, nothing you can do about that, purely genetic, right? And B, that they work hard, which, hey, that one you can do something about, then there's a lot of pressure that people put on themselves and people put on each other to work hard. If someone is complaining about things not going the way that they want them to go, if someone's complaining that they're not as successful as they would like to be, it is an easy default response that you can say pretty much at any time that, well, you got to work harder at it. Even in those cases where there's an acknowledgement that that's not always an option, or that that's not always possible or easy or whatever, that people's circumstances are different. it still can be said. It can still be said, yeah, I know it's rough, because if you're going to find success at that, you got to work really hard at it, and you're not able to because blah, blah, blah. So it's still put in there as the reason that something's not working, as opposed to looking at systemic and environmental factors. I know I get into politics a lot, but that's because in the work that I do, systems and environmental factors tend to be overlooked. Even in therapy, even in coaching, generally speaking, as an industry, that kind of stuff tends to be overlooked, because if someone is coming to work with you as a therapist or as a coach, well, who's there? Is you and them. There's not a lot that we can do about the large systems and institutions. There's not a lot we can do about the environment and the structures of power and things that have been happening for generations, if not longer, and etc. So we focus in on what we can do, which is talk. Different forms of therapy. It's not all talk therapy, but generally talk in the idea that we can find something, come up with something that a person can change, primarily about themselves, because that's where they have the most control, the most impact, is changing things about themselves. So there's reason to focus on that. And over time, it becomes more and more about that, and people lose track of the limitations of that or the reason for focusing on that, to the extent now that most of the time, when people are dealing with big problems that they would consider worth going to therapy to discuss or coaching to work on, they're looking pretty much only at the variables that they control. And I try to remind people that there's utility in looking at other variables, because first of all, control isn't a binary. There's nothing that is 100% under your control. That's the entire point of talking about executive functioning, is that even your own behavior, you have limits to your ability to control that. You have a lot, if we're looking at the factors that control that, you have a lot more control proportionately over your own behavior, your own thoughts, your own feelings than you do on anything else, but not total. A lot of the toxic positivity that will come out from people loses track of that distinction. People will say things like, everybody has to choose how they respond to things. You're in charge of how you feel about what happened. And you're not. You can impact how you respond to things. It's not completely out of your conscious control, but it's also not completely under your conscious control. And even your own emotions, they arise. You can observe them and do things to try and modify them once you observe them. But to prevent them completely, to make it so that you never experience sadness or anger or distress of any kind, that's impossible. But it's an easy and convenient answer when somebody else is telling you that they're sad or angry or feeling hopeless about something, to say, well, you are in charge of how you feel, so you should change how you feel about that. Just choose to feel better. On the flip side, when somebody says that to you, and it's frustrating, because it usually is when somebody says that to you, it's an easy response to come back and say, no, I am not in control of this. I have no control of this. Whether that's being ascribed to organic, biological things, this is about a chemical imbalance. There's nothing I can do about it, which is a whole thing worth talking about, I suppose. Maybe. I don't want to ruffle people's feathers too much, because I don't want to take away anything from people that are helpful. And these answers are helpful. Primarily, they're helpful in cutting off further exploration. If I'm experiencing a problem and I can say that I'm experiencing the problem because I'm not working hard enough, or if I'm experiencing a problem and I can say that I'm experiencing a problem because it's an organic condition and there's nothing I can do about it, that probably doesn't actually resolve the problem. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the problem itself is just in how I'm perceiving myself and in how I'm thinking about what's happening. So thinking about it in that way can help in and of itself. But generally, the problems originate with something that happens. Even if I'm thinking about myself in a particular way that's causing me distress now, that probably started because of something that happened. And the things that happen that are problematic, they might continue to happen, they might change. It obviously depends on what the thing is and what other factors and variables are involved. But if I come up with an answer to the problem of it's happening because X, and X is anything that I can't do anything about because of the systems in place, because of my biology, because that's just who I am, because that's just who they are, etc. Because then I stop thinking about the problem. I'll think about it again if and when it becomes a problem again. But until then, why would I keep thinking about it? I've already thought about it. I've realized, yeah, there's nothing I can do about it. Well, I'm glad it's helpful for you to hear today. I'm just like throwing stuff out there. I'm efforting. Things are more nuanced and complicated than that. And I want to be clear that I'm not trying to take anything away from anybody that they've found useful, especially in terms of thinking of things as biological conditions. I'm not trying to say that anything isn't that. I'm just saying that to whatever extent something is a chemical imbalance or any other biological condition, it still responds to more variables than just that one. No matter what, no matter if you are anxious, no matter what that anxiety is stemming from, whatever biological or neurological difference that is creating that experience of anxiety for you, you're still not the same level of anxious, the same kind of anxious about the same things moment to moment. There are times that are better for you and times that are worse for you. And who you are has a big role to play in what things are better and what things are worse. It changes. It's different for different people, but it's still always worth looking at, well, okay, within the constraints that I have, what can I do? Right? Like if you want to play in the NBA and you are 5'4", I don't know why this is what popped in my head. This feels like a terrible example, but I started it, so we're running with it. You can't make yourself magically be taller. You're right. Biologically, you are the height that you are. And so the chances that you're going to play in the NBA are pretty low. I think there was one person, I'm thinking the name Muggsy Bogues, but I'm not really an aficionado of professional sports generally, but certainly not the NBA, who was about that height and played in the NBA, but I'm not sure. So you have constraints. There are things that you must accept, must deal with, even if not permanently, at least in the moment. For now, in this particular situation, these are the constraints. This is what's happening. And then within those constraints, you do have some choice. So if you really want to get into the NBA and you're 5'4", then it guides your decision making. You're probably going to want to focus a lot on, and again, why'd I pick an example of something I don't know a lot about? I don't know. Focus a lot on ball handling, I believe is a thing, on three-point shooting, on the kinds of things that don't require height as much, but are still valuable in that context. So we have a choice within constraint. Exploring the environmental and systemic factors in a person's life, the things that they have no control over, or at least have very, very limited ability to impact, if at all, is useful because it helps clarify the constraints. And honestly, a lot of the time when I'm working with somebody, it's something that happens earlier on, because one of the things that tends to get in people's way is the idea that they could do something if only they thought, felt, or behaved in some different way, right? The idea that's the source of any distress about what you're doing or experiencing, is the idea that it could be differently. It could be better in some way. I shouldn't say any. Obviously, there are many things that are inherently, in and of themselves, painful, uncomfortable, distressing. But when we're talking about your feelings about your own behavior, I wish that I wasn't behaving the way that I am. You're comparing that against some other option that you think would be preferable. And that's great, because we're considering what other possibilities are there. What could I do next time? How could I modify this so that I don't repeat this experience, make it better in some way? Except that sometimes when you look closely at what is the preferable way to behave, it's not really there. It doesn't actually exist. And this working hard thing is a big, big part of that, I have found anecdotally. That the idea that if I just were to work harder, things would be better. And I think a lot of it has to do with that messaging around, look at these successful people and how hard they work. But if being more successful really meant that you had to work harder, then why would anybody want to be successful? What would be the point of having $1 million or $1 billion if having that required that you work harder in your life than somebody who doesn't have that? In fact, in many ways, don't we often talk about success purely as the ability to give up on working hard, to work less hard or not at all, right? You got to work hard, power through so that you can, there's an old, I don't know, story, joke, I don't know what we would call it, that I've heard in like motivational speaker circles of a guy, some business consultant on vacation who's in some locale where the local fishers go out and they catch some fish and come in, and then in the afternoon they eat lunch and they relax and hang out and they don't work for the rest of the day. And he goes up to one of them eventually and says something like, I've noticed you guys come in, but there's still plenty of sunlight. You could go out and get more. And they say, why would we want to go get more? He said, well, because if you get more, then you can take the extra and you can sell it and make more money. And why would we want more money? Well, because then you can take that money and you could buy more boats and hire other people to go out and do fishing for you so that you could get even more and make even more money. And why would we want more? Well, eventually you could get to a place where other people are taking care of all the things that you need to take care of, and you can relax and retire and just go hang out on the beach all day and play music with your friends like you're doing right now, right? We lose track of those end goal pieces a lot because that's really not how we're evolved to work, right? To really make a connection in executive functioning, we'll label this different things. Different experts on executive functioning call it different things. I like to call it sequencing, and that's a relatively common way of talking about it. To hold a sequence in mind, whether that's a chronological or, general to specific or whatever, what we're talking about is multiple connections, connecting A to B in some way, B to C in some way, C to D in some way, and on and on. And for whatever reason, different people in different domains, certainly, I shouldn't say whatever reason for that. In different domains, everybody has a different ability to hold those sequences. The better language you have, the more experience, the more knowledge you have around that specific domain, the easier it is to hold sequences in mind in working memory. And it seems to be that for some reason, this is the part I was saying, for whatever reason, that some people seem to have an ability to hold larger sequences in mind kind of across the board. Not that they're going to have, the ability to hold a long sequence in mind about any given domain equally, but that something about sequencing generally when they approach a new domain becomes easier for them as compared to the average person. And sometimes we lump that in with what we generally consider intelligence, which is the other hugely problematic explanation we give around success and failure. Anyway, why did I start saying that? I totally forgot what I was even saying there. Let's see. Backing up, I was talking about intelligence, talking about, sequencing. So planning is a huge part of this, because usually in terms of executive functioning, when people are talking about planning, mostly they're talking about some kind of offloading style of planning, meaning utilizing something external to make a plan, coming up with a schedule or a prioritization list or something, right? But of course, we plan constantly. Planning just means I have identified a thing that I want to happen for whatever reason. Sometimes I don't care about it personally, but they care about it, and I'm going to do it because they are going to hurt me if I don't, or whatever. There's still something I am hoping happens, want to happen. And then I try to work backwards from there to make a connection all the way back to where I'm at, where I'm starting. So now I've designed a sequence backwards, and now I got to enact that sequence. And that sequence can be great. It can be accurate and strong and logical, and every step does actually lead to the next step in the way that you think. Of course, it doesn't always work out that way. Sometimes we miss things and misunderstand things, and things happen, and the plan has to be changed, right? But let's assume for this that it is a good, solid one that will have the impact that you think it will have. Even if that's the case, and even if you write it down, the longer that sequence is, the less each piece of that sequence is going to feel like you're doing anything. If you have a million steps from A to wherever you're trying to end up, then doing step one isn't going to feel like much of anything at all. And if step one is something that is in and of itself enjoyable, that's okay, because we'll do it anyway, even though it doesn't necessarily super feel connected to step 1 million and step 2 and so on. But as soon as you hit a step that is in and of itself unenjoyable or even painful or uncomfortable, it becomes very, very difficult to move forward on that next step when the goal is so distant, right? And I think, generally know this. I don't think I'm saying anything to anybody that you don't know. I'm just using some different language to try and make it so that it might be easier to hold in mind, because we want those sequences to be shorter. And we do that in a lot of ways. It can be done very well and helpfully by trying to find, okay, let's break something big into something small. Although honestly, the process of doing that is quite often unhelpful as well, because if I know that it's still, this small piece still only matters for the end, it's hard to trick your brain. In fact, I would say it's pretty impossible to trick your own brain, but you can be tricked. Your brain can be tricked. It's tricked all the time. We're wrong all the time, and people can help you do that. And you can kind of cause other people or something in the environment to trick your brain, even though you're doing that deliberately. But it has to involve other people or the environment. You can't just say it in your own head. But really, we just want faster payoff. And so a lot of the time what we do is we insert these we insert these, fictional is not the right word. I don't know what word I'm looking for. Interim goals, interim steps, interim purposes. Take academics, for example. The goal of academics, if you ask anybody, what is the goal of academics? What is the goal of education? Different people will give you different answers, but it's usually going to be some version of, to educate people, to help them learn, to make them smarter, to let them know more things. Or if people are looking at the function of that, why we would care about those things, they'll say things like, so that people can be helpful, responsible people, that they can live independently or be good citizens of a community, good, neighbors and whatever. Cool, fine. I mean, I have my own thoughts about what the goals of education should be, but generally you're going to get answers somewhere in that direction. Really practically, mostly people are going to say so that you can get a good job. You got to go to school and work hard so you can get good grades, so you can go to a good college, so you can get a degree and get a good job. Usually is the actual answer at the end of that. And again, I have my own thoughts about what the answer should be. The whole point of academics is that we are removing the necessity of learning some skill or gaining some knowledge from the actual, real, practical reason that we might think that that knowledge or that skill is relevant or useful. That's what it means to make something academic. At this point, it's mostly academic, right? Is we're saying it's worth exploring or interesting to explore, or it helps to learn or develop something removed from the context of the actual situation, the actual problem in which that information or that skill might actually be helpful. And that's great. We do that all the time. We want to do that. We want to be able to learn how to navigate something before we're actually having to navigate it, because when the time comes is not a great time to be learning about it. You kind of just figure out your best way forward. So we want to do it in advance. But then how do we get people to do things in advance that are not inherently enjoyable? And this is a big part of the problem with how education is constructed, that are not inherently enjoyable, but we do determine are to be important, even though there's no way to point out to someone right now. We can talk. It's important because later, blah, blah, blah. Is we have to come up with these interim goals. We make grades rather than looking at, you have to learn this thing because someday X, Y, or Z, it's you have to do this homework because it's worth points. You have to take this test because it affects your grade. And your grade, especially when you're young, the younger you are, the truer this is. The older you get, the closer you're getting to the relevance of grades in terms of getting into university, which is in and of itself, again, another problem, that whole part of the system. But the further you get from that, the younger you go, the less something like that is going to matter, partly because it really actually practically doesn't. Whatever grades or whatever, progress reports you get when you're in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, no university is going to look at that stuff anyway. So at that point, we're saying it's meant to be an indication of a student's learning. And yet, those things typically are still assigned to the child, right? That we say that oh, the kid isn't putting in the work. And again, the younger you go, hopefully not a lot of kindergarten teachers are out there saying, yeah, they're just not trying hard enough, but some definitely are, and probably a lot more than is helpful. And I'm not judging the kindergarten teachers on this, by the way. They are in a bad system where they don't have a better option. They don't have other language. They don't have another choice. They have to still assign progress reports to these kids. They have to give reasoning. And what reasoning could they possibly give? If the child is getting the same instruction as everybody else in the class, but that child is not performing to the level that the other kids in the class are performing, what reasoning are they supposed to give? Sometimes there's an answer. Sometimes we say, hey, let's go through an assessment process because I think there might be some kind of learning disability or something like that. But if there's not something identifiable like that, then what is a teacher supposed to say? I don't know. They just don't seem to be taking to it. I don't know. They just seem to be bad at it for some inexplicable reason. More often than not, it's going to end up being, I don't know why it's not working for this child the way that it's working for the other children. But I think probably if they did some more work, extra work, not even necessarily saying that they're not doing enough in terms of like they're not doing what I'm asking. It might be, yeah, they're doing everything they're supposed to do, and it's still not at the level that we want to see or that the other kids are at. So let's talk about some summer programs or some tutoring or some additional thing. So even when people are being great, and again, I hope most are, about not saying that it's their fault and that they should just work harder or whatever, the solution that comes back is still going to almost always be some version of they need to put more resources toward this thing. You don't find, and I'm not suggesting this would be a great thing either, but you don't find a lot of conversations about, yeah, they don't seem to be taking well to this thing. So let's look at redesigning your expectations of them and what we ask them to do in school moving forward in order to de-emphasize this thing and focus on things that come to them more naturally. That would be great in an ideal system where we actually were able to like monitor and respond to things. We cannot, and therefore we should not do it that way either, because then we're just cutting off people's opportunities to explore things based on metrics that we're assigning and assessing for at early ages in comparison to other people. I'm just saying we don't talk about it like that. We don't talk about it because even me suggesting that, doesn't that feel gross, right? Like to say, oh yes, this kindergartner isn't reading at the same level as the other kindergartners, so let's just decide that for the rest of their life they're never going to be as much into reading or as good at reading as other people, and therefore they shouldn't do it. It's gross. We shouldn't do that. I hope I've been clear about that. But that doesn't mean that the way that we're doing it is better. What could and should be happening in the system that we're using, I don't even know what I'm off talking about now. I just give me some comments or questions to pull me back onto something else. Otherwise, I'm just rambling because I don't know what else to do. I'm not really rambling. I'm just saying I know I'm jumping on a lot of different points because I'm following down whatever chain of logic seems interesting to me, since I don't have a particular goal in front of me, a person who's asking a particular question or looking for a particular thing. I'm just talking about whatever I find interesting, and I tend to find one path interesting and go on that and then on another. Those metrics and those assessments are good because the goal is so long term. It's so far down the sequence that nobody can actually really hold it in mind. And even if you could, how do we say specifically that this thing that we're doing today in kindergarten kids does make you better suited to whatever the goal is that we're saying we have in education? So we have to insert these interim goals. That was just a long side journey into the fact that grading and assessments and diagnostic tools and all that are great because we have to use them in an academic environment. How else would we be able to measure and track whether what we're doing has any value? Again, I have ideas about that, but I'm talking about in the current system. How else would we track what has value? But when we track that stuff, rather than being applied to the individual children and what that individual child needs to do differently in order to come back on level with their peers or whatever, those those metrics should be used to dictate what is happening in the classroom. And again, they are a lot. And in some places and in some classrooms, they're used a lot more for that and a lot less for the other thing. But as you get older and older, pretty inevitably, in my anecdotal experience, I don't have good like research data on this, as kids get older and older, those grades get assigned, the reasoning behind those grades gets assigned to the child more and more. By the time you're in high school, certainly by the time you're in university, if somebody fails a class, nobody's having conversations about in what way did the class fail to support and teach them, or at least very rarely are we having conversations about that. And almost always we're having conversations about what are they doing wrong? What are they missing? What is the mistake that they are making? Are they not understanding the content and they need to spend extra time on that? Are they not getting the homework in, even though, oh man, they have such great potential. They're so bright, they get it, but they just don't turn stuff in or whatever. We do those things. We insert those interim goals because we can't actually remember all 1 million steps. And even if we could, we can't really track whether something's getting us closer to something that's that far away in a sequence. So back to what we were saying before that is that different people have different abilities to hold sequence in mind with different levels of resource. Some it's easier, it's harder to hold longer, shorter sequences within specific domains. And what we were saying right before that is even if the sequence you come up with, the plan you come up with is great and works exactly the way that you would want it to work, when you're doing step one, if it's of a 3-step thing, as you're doing it, you can hold the sequence in mind, and working on step one feels like working towards step 3. If you have 100 steps, you can't really hold all 100 steps in mind. So doing step one doesn't feel like working towards step 100. It feels like something you're supposed to do because you decided or somebody decided that you should do it. It was step 1 of 100. But in the moment that you're doing it, it doesn't feel like that. It doesn't pay off in that way. You know, for example, there's a lot of talk about what people will call false productivity, which how that's usually described is a form of procrastination that is in and of itself productive, but not the task that is intended to be accomplished, right? I'm supposed to be doing my homework, and instead I clean my room. Well, what might be a part of the reason that I would shift from doing my homework to cleaning my room? It's a very short sequence. Even though the action of cleaning my room isn't in and of itself enjoyable to me, as soon as I do something, I see what happened. So every step that I take, I get immediate feedback on how, yes, I'm getting closer to my goal. I'm getting closer to my goal. Notice that you can have a messy room, messy kitchen, messy house for days, weeks, months at a time and not be too bothered by it. Maybe, I should clean it up, but it doesn't cause you any visceral like discomfort or something. And then once you start cleaning it, you'll often get into a place where you get it clean to what, at any other point, if someone said, hey, this is how clean it is, you'd be like, wow, fantastic. But you're in that mode where you're cleaning, you've got it clean to that point, and now you're just focusing in on smaller and smaller and smaller things. Wow, look at that I got to get this counter perfectly. Because there's that immediate feedback. So it doesn't involve holding a long sequence in mind. It's just I'm doing a thing and seeing why I'm doing it. People will talk about this as, I like working with my hands. I like creating something that I can see that has substance, that is real. There's something inherently satisfying to me about that. People talk about it like it's a personality trait. I like to do something where I see something come from my efforts. Everybody does. We don't all think about it, talk about it in the same way, don't define the same things to be that kind of a task. We have differences. But of course, we like to see the fruits of our efforts. The brain is a cognitive miser. It doesn't spend resources without a reason. So why would anybody want to throw resources at something that isn't enjoyable in and of itself, or restorative or restful in and of itself in any way, and also doesn't seem to accomplish anything? So the talk about delayed gratification, for example, originating with the marshmallow test, which we've talked about on the stream before, is really just people equating some concept, some portion of what they're calling intelligence, with the idea that you can hold a longer sequence in mind and do something now that won't pay off until later. And the later and the later and the later and the later it goes before it pays off, the longer the sequence you're holding in mind, the better, somehow, inevitably. It can be if you use it in certain ways, but it is not inherently better. This is totally therapy hour. I like that, except it is definitely not. But I do like that. I hope it's therapeutically helpful in the sense that it's information, it's thoughts, it's ideas that can be helpful to a person, whether it's in what you're doing or what you're feeling or whatever. But therapy is an interpersonal thing, and I would love to talk about therapy for a long time, but I don't know. Ask questions if you want to know. Yeah, there's nothing inherently valuable about doing something that doesn't pay off for a long time. And the longer it takes before it pays off, the better it is. This is related to our ideas about resilience and grit. The idea that you're doing something that is painful, difficult, unenjoyable in some way for a payoff, and it's not paying off, and it's not paying off, but you keep at it. You keep banging your head against the wall, keep suffering, it'll pay off, and then it does. Wonderful. And that actually does feel wonderful when it happens. But sometimes you keep suffering and it doesn't actually pay off later. So if the idea is you're supposed to just keep suffering until it pays off, how are you ever supposed to determine when it's one of the times that it will and when it's one of the times that it won't? All of that still is about sequencing. You're doing it because you've been told to do it, because you've been given some interim goal. Yes, this will help pay off in X, Y, Z kind of a way, but don't worry about that. Just do it. Because really you're doing it because mom and dad asked you to do it, because your spouse asked you to do it, because your kids need you to do it, your friends, your boss, your colleagues, your teachers, because people need you to do it or have asked you to do it, and they will think better of you if you do it, and they'll think worse of you if you don't. The vast, vast, vast majority of what we do as humans, well, I shouldn't say the vast majority, because how could we possibly distinguish? I'm just saying the idea that somebody else would like or dislike something that you do is weighed into probably pretty much everything that you do, because humans are social creatures. That's how we've evolved. It has to be taken. We might think of that as like, oh, people pleasing, and I don't want to do things just because other people, and that makes sense. But also, what do you think of somebody who does whatever they want to do without any thought for how it might impact other people and whether other people will like them or dislike them based on what they do, right? What do you do in therapy to recognize the influence of things outside of your control while still trying to make progress? So what we're going for is accuracy. It's not that one thing is better than the other, except that accuracy in terms of what you're looking at tends to be better in terms of designing something to do to make something change, right? That wasn't very helpful. What I mean is, so if you're in a place where you're feeling really terribly about something, really despondent, just full of despair, and somebody starts putting out to you, hey, look at this bright side, look at this bright side, look at this bright side. That could be terrible if it's inaccurate, or it could be really helpful if it's accurate, because then you get to look at what are the things that you have done that have worked, what are the things that exist that are beneficial. You get access to that information and you can start pulling from it instead of just focusing on failures. Because if all you know is what hasn't worked, you know what not to try, and you can come up with something else to try. But it's going to be, whatever reasoning you have for what you come up with is based around what hasn't worked in the past. So you're kind of just, by process of elimination, trying to find something that works, and it will get there. But if you can look at what has already worked, it's a lot easier and more efficient to pull some things that you know have worked. They might not work again in a new context, in a new thing, and it's always a new context. But you have something more guiding your choices next. So it can be good in that way. It can be terrible if we're just minimizing, right? On the flip side, if somebody's coming around saying, oh, everything's wonderful and there's no problems with anything, and then you're saying, no, it's worse, that can be good too, because we want to deal with the reality of what's actually happening. The point I'm trying to make there is that what we're trying to do in therapy is to just help people to look at the things that they're not currently looking at. A lot of different therapists, there's many different theories and processes and techniques, and they're all beneficial, or they wouldn't exist. Especially the more popular one is, the more beneficial it is. And that benefit isn't always 100% about the person experience, the client in the therapeutic process, because there are profit motivations and things like that as well. So, Doesn't mean everything is wonderful and every therapist is great. It does mean that, generally speaking, some people have found utility in what's happening. So what specifically you do, in fact, we have research on this, that technique, the specific thing that a therapist is doing in the therapeutic process, is a very small portion, a very small part of the correlation between how a client experiences the success or the benefit of that process. The thing that matters most, I'm blanking on the name of the person who did the research, so I can't point you to it right now. The common factors of therapy. According to that research, the thing that matters the most is what's called client factors, which just means things get better in your life for some reason that have nothing to do with therapy. That's like 40% of it, I think, is what they said, which means that the therapist's job is just kind of to be there with you, keep you going, make it easier to go along until things get better. And then the next biggest part is the therapeutic relationship, which doesn't matter about technique, except what your technique is dictates how well you can form and maintain a good relationship. And then it's something like 10% to technique. So it's not necessarily about the technique. And what I was trying to say is, for me, I think at the end of the day, a therapist needs to come to grips with the idea that we don't actually control anything. We can't fix anything. We can't make anything worse. The only thing we can do is, in the moment, in that 50 minutes or however long that we're meeting, is we can do everything we can in that moment to be beneficial. And sometimes people take that to be that it's like a break, a relaxation. It's the rest of your life is stressful and hard, and you get tense and tense and tense. Then you come to therapy and we kind of process and ground you and kind of release it all. And then you go back out and the rest of your week's going to get worse and tense and tense. And then you come back and that's okay. It's not the way that I like to do it, but that's okay. The way I like to think of it is, we can have experiences, you and I. We can build language. We can communicate one with another, come up with new ideas, evoke new concepts. And once that happens, that stuff sticks in your head. So we're looking at trying to come up with stuff that when you go away, now that you have this new language, this new whatever, you're better equipped to deal with whatever's coming at you. So I was starting to say there that what I want to look at is, we're trying to guide your attention to things that you haven't looked at before, because nothing is actually 100% outside of your control as it relates to your personal experience of it. That's part of, I think, the truth underneath that toxic positivity. Everybody controls how they feel about things, chooses how they feel about things. It's true that regardless of the reality of what's happening, your awareness of it to some extent is something that you can manipulate. And there are things that you're aware of that make you miserable because you're aware of them. And if you weren't aware of them, you wouldn't be miserable about it. And I'm not saying we should all stick our heads in the sand or anything like that. But I'm saying that even something like, for example, climate change, which you as an individual can't really do much about in real practical terms. That doesn't mean don't try. It doesn't mean don't do what you can do. It just means if you're worried about what's happening with the global climate, regardless of you doing all the things that you can do, that's unlikely to make much of a dent on it. Mental health providers most helpful for me was a person who listened really well to what I was saying and used my own metaphors in responding. Yeah, so what we would talk about, that is developing language, right? Using the client's language in order to develop a shared language. I will often do that in talking about people's interests, right? That we'll talk about a show that they like, or a video game that they like, or a hobby, or whatever, because we can encapsulate a lot. We can discuss more efficiently if we have language that we can use together. That's what metaphors are for, right? Is putting a lot of nuance into a shorter phrase. Rather than trying to cover all of the things, we just paint a picture that has limits and leaves all of those things floating in the air for people to find. So we want to look at what's outside of the control, because sometimes the problem is what we call, in fact, often in therapy, I don't know who calls it this. There's a concept. I learned the phrase, the second arrow, as a Buddhist concept. I'm not Buddhist, and I didn't learn it in a Buddhist, environment, context. And I don't even really know if it's true. But I was told that this concept of the second arrow is a Buddhist concept, referring to how you feel about how you feel, or how you feel about what you did, what you think about what you thought. So a thing happens and I become angry. And then I'm like, damn it, why did I get angry again? What is wrong with me? A thing happens and I become sad. And I say, why am I always sad? A thing happens and then I smoke, or a thing happens and then I eat things I wasn't intending to eat, or a thing happens and I do anything that I don't like that I did. And I focus in on my reaction then, and I'm upset about my reaction. What is it about me that makes me the kind of person who keeps getting angry, getting sad, smoking, eating stuff I'm not supposed to eat, whatever? So looking at environments outside, or looking at the influence of things outside of your control, can be helpful in and of itself with that kind of stuff, because you shift blame from this unusable thing. I'm lazy, right? I do this because I'm lazy. That's fine. It's an accurate answer, because that's what lazy means. It means somebody who doesn't do what they intend to do, but it's not very useful. What are you supposed to do about that? Your whole thing when you're saying you're lazy is that no matter what plans you make and what things you do, you're not very likely to follow through, or less likely to follow through than somebody else or something. So what do we do with that? And I want to take away that sticky answer, that idea, so that you explore it more. So if we talk about environmental factors, it's not that I know what they are. I can talk about things. My goal is to talk about things or bring things up that sound relevant to you, so that it guides your attention looking in that stuff, so that as you go about your day and your life, when I'm not there, because I'm not there, that you will maybe see some things, notice some things, observe some things that you didn't before, that might enable you to change the reality of what's happening, or might enable you to change your perception of the reality of what's happening. That's what we're talking about. Therapy isn't just about how do you fix everything. You can't, especially in things like existential therapy, which we'll talk a lot about, the four universal existential fears of death, isolation, meaninglessness, and freedom. That there's nothing you can do about that. So it's just navigating, coming to grips with it. I like things like that. The idea that therapy is not, here's normal, good functioning, you're over here. The why we disagree about, some people will say because you've been injured, this trauma brought you over here. And I'm not saying that's not true. Some will say it's a chemical imbalance. Some will say it's a pattern of behavior. Some will say blah, blah, blah. Different theories will say different things, but it's all, here's good, normal functioning. You're over here. Now we need to heal you to get you back to good, normal functioning, which isn't a thing. It's not a completable process. And people don't like to talk about it that way. So it's worth, I think, not exclusively by any means, but it's worth looking at the things that you're not looking at that might be relevant or influential or have an impact on what you're experiencing, just to be aware of the reality of the situation. What impact do you have? Where is it worth spending your resources? Because that's what we're always looking for, is what's worth trying next. I describe my ability to get things done as either a tight spring or slinky state, and the first time he used the same phrases back to me, I almost want to cry. It's funny how rare it is to feel legitimately hurt. Yeah. Do you have advice on, when you are looking for a new provider, how to recognize a provider that will be able to develop a shared language with you? I honestly don't have a good answer for that. I wish there was a better way. Obviously, there are databases online where you can go and look and you can see people's profiles, but people are incentivized to write profiles that draw in clients, as opposed to writing profiles that give an accurate picture of what it is like to work with them. Hopefully, people are doing both, being accurate about themselves and trying to reach the kinds of clients that are looking for the kind of work that they're doing. So you can look that way. Of course, health insurance is involved in this process. And if you're looking to use health insurance, you're limited to the people that are contracted with your health insurance company. So you have to look through those lists. The best solution I have for this, and it's a limited one, is literally this, what we're doing right now. I don't know how I can possibly tell a potential client exactly what it is like to work with us, to work with me or anybody here. Because how am I supposed, I don't even know what it will be. How am I supposed to say what it will be like? But this, if I'm sitting here on stream for an hour a week, you can see what I'm like, what I talk like, what I think, right? It's vulnerable. It's uncomfortable, although I'm getting more and more comfortable with it over time, but it is vulnerable. I in this moment am stressed and am holding the tension of, what if somebody hears me say something, and then they interpret it in this kind of different way, or what if they interpret it accurately but they hate it and they want to come after me. It is vulnerable to be this visible, and a lot of therapists, whether accurately or inaccurately, have come up with theories about why therapists shouldn't be visible anyway, right? Like, there are entire theories of therapy where you're literally not supposed to look at the therapist because they're not a person. They're not supposed to be there at all. And I understand the reasoning behind that. I just disagree, because you have to choose somebody, and how are you going to choose? So I would say look for people who are visible, who put things out there, who do things like we also do. In addition to stuff like this and being on podcasts and whatever, I also do a free consult that when people are considering coming to work with us, the very first step for everybody, even if they come in saying, yeah, well, I want to start working with somebody right away, we don't do it that way. We say there's a free consult with Brandon directly, although at some point I will have to stop doing that myself probably and start, passing that on to other people. Where we talk for 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes about whatever you want to talk about, so you can get a sense of what this is like. And then in the first session, when you're working with your therapist, that also is for you to get a sense of what it's like and decide whether they seem like a good fit to you or not. So I would say look for things where people are either visible or have very low barriers to entry, very low cost ways to interact with them and get a sense of who they are. Definitely watch out for anybody who seems to be trying to pressure you into anything or sell packages or anything like that. The goal should be, I think, and different people would disagree, but I think the goal should be that you are as best supported as you can possibly be supported in exploring, knowing what to look for, being given access and the option, I guess access is the only word I need there. Access to the information that you need in order to determine whether or not you want to continue, and that you can leave at any time, that there's not going to be any pressure. Beyond that, I have my own personal opinions, and maybe I'll share some of those real briefly, about what kinds of therapy I think generally are, therapy that had a low barrier to. Well, some of that is systemic and terrible. I very deliberately and explicitly want to make this as easily accessible as possible, and there are limits to my ability to do that because I and all the therapists that work here are not independently wealthy and can do this work without charging any money for it at all. And that sucks. And just like I was talking about with the teachers earlier, just because a thing is terrible for the kids, or in this case for the clients, doesn't mean that the practitioners or the teachers are in any better of a position. It's terrible for them too. They don't like it either, or at least some of them don't like it either, but have to anyway. That's the point of a system. What we mean when we say a system is bad is that even if within that system you're trying to do everything that you can do to make it good, it still comes out bad sometimes or in some ways. That's what a system is. My personal opinion, I'm not going to talk about theories because it doesn't. Do I mean that? Does it not really matter theory? Yeah, I think other than ABA, I think I'm just not going to talk about theory because I don't know all the theories. The only ones that I really know that I don't think there is a good way to practice it is ABA. There are others that I think generally are not well, that applying them has problematic aspects or harmful aspects to it, but that can still be done well and usefully depending on who's doing it and how, and depending mostly on the client and what they're trying to work on. So I'll stay away from that. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't give my personal opinions. It just, there's so many factors, so many variables that matter. But I would say visibility is good, but there are great therapists who are worked to the bone and don't have the time and availability, the energy to do that kind of stuff, So it's not like a one-to-one correlation. I would say, no, I'm not going to say that. because everything I keep thinking to say about my personal opinion, I just immediately think of exceptions to that rule, and I don't want to encourage anybody to judge things. The whole point of this is like trying to learn how to accurately judge a book by its cover, and there's really limited ability to do that, which is, the struggle, right? My struggle too. That's why all I can really say is people who will show you for free, or low cost to entry, low barrier to entry, that you can see as much as necessary, as much as possible for you to determine whether you want to move forward or not. That's the only thing I can across the board say, because anything else, the thing I cut myself off from saying, I was gonna make a comment about what certain kinds of offices are like or look like versus others, but that's my opinion, and there might be some correlations that match up with my opinion, but even if there's so many exceptions to it. I guess that's kind of the whole point of what I'm trying to say with all this stuff is, don't paint with a broad brush, look at the individual. And it's hard when you're in the position of a client looking for a new provider. It's just a terrible system. So databases are good because that's some visibility. Just know that people are incentivized to try and draw you in. Streaming is good. Podcast appearances are good. Blogs are good. A lot of therapists will have blogs on their website where you can read some of what they've written. And the more information you have access to, the better for you to be able to make a determination. But at the end of the day, it's still not what's going to work. It's what's worth trying. You're not going to know who's a good therapist to work with until you work with them. And even when you do, it can be going really well until it doesn't, or sometimes it's not enjoyable at first, but theoretically might pay off later. But like we talked about before, I'm not going to encourage anybody to bang your head against the wall in the hopes that it pays off. Go find something else, Yeah. Okay. I wish I had a better answer for that, but I also got to get going now. Thank you for being here. I appreciate your comments in the chat. I will be back next week, same time. I don't know what we talked about today. Sequencing. I never closed off sequencing, but it's all right. We'll get to it some other time. Thank you guys. I will be here next week.